You won't believe the adrenaline-packed tales in Rifleman Harris, an electrifying memoir by Benjamin Harris, a fearless rifleman in the British Army during the high-stakes Napoleonic Wars. This book catapults you into Harris's jaw-dropping adventures and dangerous exploits as a soldier in the elite 95th Rifles. Harris is about to embark for Portugal. Let's begin. I wish I could picture the splendid sight of the shipping in the Downs. At the time we embarked with about 20,000 men. Those were times which the soldiers of our own more peaceable days have little conception of. At Cork, where our ships cast anchor, we lay for something like 6 weeks, during which time the expedition was not disembarked, with the exception of our 4 companies of rifles, who were every day landed for the purpose of drill. On such occasions our merry bugles sounded over the country, and we were skirmished about in very lively fashion, always being embarked again at night. At the expiration of the time I have mentioned, our sails were given to the wind, and amidst the cheers of our comrades, we sailed majestically out of the Cove of Cork for the hostile shore, where we arrived safely, and disembarked at Mondego Bay. The rifles were the first out of the vessels, for we were, indeed, always in the front in advance, and in rear in the retreat. Like the Kentish men of old, we claimed the post of honour in the field. Being immediately pushed forwards up the country in advance of the main body, many of us, in this hot climate, very soon began to find out the misery of the frightful load we were condemned to march and fight under, with a burning sun above our heads, and our feet sinking every step into the hot sand. The weight I myself toiled under was tremendous, and I often wonder at the strength I possessed at this period, which enabled me to endure it, for, indeed, I am convinced that many of our infantry sank and died under the weight of their knapsacks alone. For my own part, being a handicraft, I marched under a weight sufficient to impede the free motions of a donkey, for besides my well-filled kit, there was the greatcoat rolled on its top, my blanket and camp kettle, my haversack, stuffed full of leather for repairing the men's shoes, together with a hammer and other tools. The lapstone I took the liberty of flinging to the devil, ship biscuit and beef for 3 days. I also carried my canteen filled with water, my hatchet and rifle, and 80 rounds of ball cartridge in my pouch, this last, except the beef and biscuit, being the best thing I owned, and which I always gave the enemy the benefit of, when opportunity offered. Altogether the quantity of things I had on my shoulders was enough and more than enough for my wants, sufficient, indeed, to sink a little fellow of 5 feet 7 inches into the earth. Nay, so awkwardly was the load our men bore in those days, placed upon their backs, that the free motion of the body was impeded, the head held down from the pile at the back of the neck, and the soldier half beaten before he came to the scratch. We marched till it was nearly dark, and then halted for the night. I myself was immediately posted sentinel between 2 hedges, and in a short time General Fane came up, and himself cautioned me to be alert. "Remember, sentinel," he said, "that we are now near an active enemy, therefore be careful here, and mind what you are about." Next day the peasantry sent into our camp a great quantity of the good things of their country, so that our men regaled themselves upon oranges, grapes, melons, and figs, and we had an abundance of delicacies which many of us had never before tasted. Amongst other presents, a live calf was presented to the rifles, so that altogether we feasted in our first entrance into Portugal like a company of aldermen. The next day we again advanced, and being in a state of the utmost anxiety to come up with the French, neither the heat of the burning sun, long miles, or heavy knapsacks were able to diminish our ardor. Indeed, I often look back with wonder at the light-hearted style, the jollity, and reckless indifference with which men who were destined in so short a time to fall, hurried onwards to the field of strife, seemingly without a thought of anything but the sheer love of meeting the foe and the excitement of the battle. It was 5 or 6 days before the Battle of Roliça, the army was on the march, and we were pushing on pretty fast. The whole force had slept the night before in the open fields, indeed, as far as I know, for the rifles were always in the front at this time, they had been for many days without any covering but the sky. We were pelting along through the streets of a village, the name of which I do not think I ever knew, so I cannot name it. I was in the front, and had just cleared the village, when I recollect observing General Hill, afterwards Lord Hill, and another officer ride up to a house, and give their horses to some of the soldiery to hold. Our bugles at that moment sounded the halt, and I stood leaning upon my rifle near the door of the mansion which General Hill had entered. There was a little garden before the house, and I stood by the gate. Whilst I remained there, the officer who had entered with General Hill came to the door, and called to me. "Rifleman," said he, "come here." I entered the gate, and approached him. "Go," he continued, handing me $1, "and try if you can get some wine, for we are devilish thirsty here." Taking the $1, I made my way back to the village. At a wine-house, where the men were crowding around the door and clamoring for drink, for the day was intensely hot, I succeeded, after some little difficulty, in getting a small pipkin full of wine, but the crowd was so great, that I found as much trouble in paying for it as in getting it, so I returned back as fast as I was able, fearing that the general would be impatient, and move off before I reached him. I remember Lord Hill was loosening his sword belt as I handed him the wine. "Drink first, rifleman," said he, and I took a good pull at the pipkin, and held it to him again. He looked at it as I did so, and told me I might drink it all up, for it appeared greasy, so I swallowed the remainder, and handed him back the $1 which I had received from the officer. "Keep the money," he said, "my man. Go back to the village once more, and try if you cannot get me another draft." Saying this, he handed me a second $1, and told me to be quick. I made my way back to the village, got another pipkin full, and returned as fast as I could. The general was pleased with my promptness, and drank with great satisfaction, handing the remainder to the officer who attended him, and I dare say, if he ever recollected the circumstance afterwards, that was as sweet a draught, after the toil of the morning march, as he has drank at many a nobleman's board in old England since. I remember remarking Lord Hill, for the second time in my life, under circumstances which, from their not being of everyday occurrence, fixed it upon my mind. The 29th Regiment received so terrible a fire, that I saw the right wing almost annihilated, and the colonel, I think his name was Lennox, lay sprawling amongst the rest. We had ourselves caught it pretty handsomely, for there was no cover for us, and we were rather too near. The living skirmishers were lying beside heaps of their own dead, but still we had held our own till the battalion regiments came up. Fire and retire is a very good sound, but the rifles were not over fond of such notes. We never performed that maneuver, except when it was made pretty plain to us that it was quite necessary. The 29th, however, had got their fairing here at this time, and the shock of that fire seemed to stagger the whole line, and make them recoil. At the moment a little confusion appeared in the ranks, I thought. Lord Hill was near at hand, and saw it, and I observed him come galloping up. He put himself at the head of the regiment, and restored them to order in a moment. Pouring a regular and sharp fire upon the enemy, he galled them in return, and, remaining with the 29th till he brought them to the charge, quickly sent the foe to the right about. It seemed to me that few men could have conducted the business with more coolness and quietude of manner, under such a storm of balls as he was exposed to. Indeed, I have never forgotten him from that day. At the time I was remarking these matters, loading and firing as I lay, another circumstance divided my attention for a while, and made me forget even the gallant conduct of General Hill. A man near me uttered a scream of agony, and, looking from the 29th, who were on my right, to the left, whence the screech had come, I saw one of our sergeants, named Fraser, sitting in a doubled-up position, and swaying backwards and forwards, as though he had got a terrible pain in his bowels. He continued to make so much complaint, that I arose and went to him, for he was rather a crony of mine. "Oh, Harris," said he, as I took him in my arms, "I shall die. I shall die. The agony is so great that I cannot bear it." It was, indeed, dreadful to look upon him. The froth came from his mouth, and the perspiration poured from his face. Thank heaven! He was soon out of pain, and, laying him down, I returned to my place. Poor fellow! He suffered more for the short time that he was dying, than any man I think I ever saw in the same circumstances. I had the curiosity to return and look at him after the battle. A musket ball, I found, had taken him sideways, and gone through both groins. Within about half an hour after this I left Sergeant Fraser, and, indeed, for the time, had as completely forgotten him, as if he had died 100 years back. The sight of so much bloodshed around, will not suffer the mind to dwell long on any particular casualty, even though it happened to one's dearest friend. There was no time either to think, for all was action with us rifles just at this moment, and the barrel of my piece was so hot from continual firing, that I could hardly bear to touch it, and was obliged to grasp the stock beneath the iron, as I continued to blaze away. James Ponton was another crony of mine, a gallant fellow. He had pushed himself in front of me, and was checked by one of our officers for his rashness. "Keep back, you Ponton!" the lieutenant said to him, more than once. But Ponton was not to be restrained by anything but a bullet when in action. This time he got one, which, striking him in the thigh, I suppose hit an artery, for he died quickly. The Frenchman's balls were flying very wickedly at that moment, and I crept up to Ponton, and took shelter by lying behind, and making a rest for my rifle of his dead body. It strikes me that I revenged his death by the assistance of his carcass. At any rate, I tried my best to hit his enemies hard. There were two small buildings in our front, and the French, having managed to get into them, annoyed us much from that quarter. A small rise in the ground close before these houses, also favored them, and our men were being handled very severely in consequence. They became angry, and wouldn't stand it any longer. One of the skirmishers, jumping up, rushed forward, crying, "Over, boys! Over! Over!" when instantly the whole line responded to the cry, "Over! Over! Over!" They ran along the grass like wildfire, and dashed at the rise, fixing their sword bayonets as they ran. The French light wolves could not stand the sight, but turned about, and fled, and, getting possession of their ground, we were soon inside the buildings. After the battle was over, I stepped across to the other house I have mentioned, in order to see what was going on there, for the one I remained in was now pretty well filled with the wounded, both French and English, who had managed to get there for a little shelter. 2 or 3 surgeons, also, had arrived at this house, and were busily engaged in giving their assistance to the wounded, now also here lying as thickly as in the building which I had left. But what struck me most forcibly was, that from the circumstance of some wine butts having been left in the apartment, and their having in the engagement been perforated by bullets, and otherwise broken, the red wine had escaped most plentifully, and ran down upon the earthen floor, where the wounded were lying, so that many of them were soaked in the wine with which their blood was mingled. This concludes the second part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Harris' story? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.